Hello watch enthusiasts! Now a few days ago I produced a video for 2019 covering a number of interesting smaller watches, or rather watches which would fit a smaller wrist better. And in response to that video I received quite a few points and people asking for the opposite video, so a video talking about larger watches. And I think this is a very interesting theme because it's certainly under-discussed. There are currently very few articles or videos on this subject, and I think it's a very valid point because I myself have a wrist which is a moderate, very standard size, but I enjoy both 34mm small dress watches and 45+mm dive watches. And so I think both can be enjoyed, and so in this video I'd like to speak about watches really for larger wrists, or at least people who enjoy larger watches, of which there are many. And so in this video I've tried to not simply go for dive watches, which would be the obvious category to look at for this particular type of video, but I've also tried to look at other watches from different genres, such as field watches, pilot's watches, and even a dress watch, which I think fits into this larger size wristwatch category very well, and which offers comfort, but also a more bold image on the wrist than one would normally get from a dress watch. Now the first piece I'd like to speak about does fall into the dive watch category, and this is a 1000-metre dive watch which has caused quite a stir in terms of the response I've certainly seen to my review of this watch, and in terms of my personal experience of this piece, it's an incredible offer in terms of the price and what's being offered. And usually I don't include micro-brand watches in these videos, not necessarily by choice, but just because of the circumstances and what's offered by larger, more established brands. But I think what Zoretto are doing with this watch is quite remarkable. Now this is the Jota, as in J-O-T-A, pronounced in the Spanish pronunciation, does come out that way. But this is a 1000-metre dive watch with a design which is very heavily influenced by the Yenny Caribbean dive watches of the 1960s. However, the Yennies don't exist anymore in their original form, and I think this watch is, in terms of specifications and build, a superior watch to the recreation Yennies produced today, and so I really don't find the fact that this watch is an homage in that respect any sort of problem or any sort of concern that would arise for anyone. Because this watch has a 43mm case, but it's covered by a 44.5mm bezel, which gives you a very large area to grip this 120-click bezel. The lug-to-lug length of this watch is remarkably moderate for a watch of this size and this construction, and that's 50.5mm from lug to lug. The watch is 14.6mm thick, making it relatively hefty, but as a general build it fits very well on the wrist, and the detailing on this watch is excellent. The case is fully polished, except one sees details such as the fact the lugs are divergent, so they actually get wider and further apart as they extend from the case, which creates this triangular form, which I think looks phenomenal. There is also a helium escape valve mounted to the opposite side of the case to the crown, which gives that ability to use this watch for saturation diving, and then on the opposite side of the watch one has the crown, which is 7.5mm across, making it very sizable, with 3 gaskets inside it to increase water resistance, and of course it is signed and screwed down. Then on the front of the watch one sees a great deal of sapphire, because this watch has a domed style of sapphire crystal which is 3.3mm thick with this metal rim around it, and then around the outside of that one has this sapphire insert for the bezel. And whilst ceramic would be a more modern solution to this, I think the sapphire works very well because it means that one can have a fully luminous bezel, so all of the graduations are luminous, apart from the small graduations every minute between 0 and 20. And then one has a variety of different versions for the bezel, such as the blue version, the black version, and then for the black version one also has the option of a 12-hour bezel to be able to use this bezel as a GMT function as well. Now, the scratch resistance of this is incredibly high, and so one doesn't have that modernity of ceramic, but it does give a beautiful translucence as well due to the use of sapphire, and I think is very satisfactory. The dial matches the general aesthetic very well, and is finished to have this almost mirror-like surface in either black or blue, with applied indices as well as these beautifully sculpted hands, which have sharp edges, and also have this bevel down the centre to appear more like swords than would otherwise be the case. All of this is legible as well in the dark thanks to very strong luminova, and the date is hidden at 4:30 in a matching colour to the dial, which I think is a beautiful touch, and the fact that the lacquer on the surface of the dial spills into that date window just adds a certain element of detail to this watch to be appreciated. And the dial is very simple about what it states, simply saying Zoretto automatic 1000 metres, 3,300 feet. And the automatic is in reference to the movement, which in this watch is an ETA 2824-2, the automatic 25-joule darling of the watch industry, where Swiss watchmaking is concerned, because this is a movement which is extremely widely used and probably is the most used Swiss-made movement, and offers really every specification you could expect, with from hacking to hand winding, as well as having automatic winding and a 38-hour power reserve. It also has a very smooth second-hand run, running at 4 Hz, and really is the ideal movement for this watch. But incredibly, the price for this watch is staggering considering what this offers. And this watch isn't a Swiss-made watch, and I do emphasise that, but it does have a Swiss-made movement, and the version which I was testing for the review kept time extremely well as well. And for the $599 this watch costs, or the $529 during sales, you also get a metal bracelet in this beads of rice style, which is all solid and finished beautifully with polishing and brushing, as well as an expandable clasp with a dive extension which is ratcheting, and also a strap which is finished in very attractive leather with an embossed style of patterning that resembles ray skin. And so I think for the price of this watch you really are getting an incredibly comprehensive package, and really the ideal watch that really wipes the floor with competition at this sort of price range for a larger professional dive watch with fantastic specifications and accessories. This next watch comes from a brand which I have a great deal of respect personally, but also technologically for, as a brand which operates still on a small scale in Germany, but which produces some truly fantastic watches. And this is of course Laco with their Flieger 45mm. And the Flieger was conceived in the 1930s as a military pilot's watch, and certainly I think it's worth noting this does have quite a dark history in terms of its use. However, it is undeniable that this design of pilot's watch has shaped the way that all pilot's watches are addressed, and indeed still does, as the most simple form for a great deal of bezel-less pilot's watches. But Laco produced this rather remarkable version of it in a 45mm size, which is 10mm less than their largest model, and also the original from the 1930s and 40s, but it's a piece which I think fits large wrists extremely well, as a result of its short lugs, which means that it should fit a wide variety of wrists, but also its large and highly legible dial. And aside from its very utilitarian case design, it's the details which jump out with this watch. Most notably the fact that the surface of this case has been coated to create this very attractive and very grey finish, which doesn't look like normal steel. And the reason for this is that it's trying to mimic the coloration of the original cases used, and gives this sort of matte surface which I think looks fantastic. The crown also matches this coloration, and is this large onion style of crown protruding at 3, which is extremely easy to grip both with gloves or without, as was the original need for these crowns to be this way. And on the opposite side of the case one sees engraved into the case the number and the code FL23883, which was the original commission code for these watches. The case back of this watch is closed, so one can't see the movement, but instead you can see, as with the original watches of this sort, a number of codes on the case back, which denote the original codes for the watch and the design, which I think is very clever, whilst also showing what movement is inside the watch and the various specifications. The movement inside this watch comes really in 2 variants depending upon what you want out of the piece, because aside from the dials which vary, which I'll speak about in a moment, the movements vary depending upon whether you want a manually wound watch or an automatic watch. And so they offer the Laco 04, which is an ETA 2804, which is essentially an ETA 2824 with the automatic winding section not mounted, which means you get 38 hours of power reserve and it runs at 4 Hz and is wound from the crown. Or you can get the ETA 2824, being the Laco 24, which is the same in terms of specifications, and indeed the same specifications as the Zoretto, but is of course automatic, which is a function for those who want the watch to be a little bit more modern in its operation, but personally for the sake of purity I would always go for the original manually wound style of watch, especially since the price remains the same for both versions. But then on the front of the watch one sees, beneath this rather beautifully domed sapphire crystal, which is immense and encompasses the whole front of the watch, with a bevel around its edge, and also imitates the original very, very well, one has a dial which comes in 2 versions. Both are matte black, but you get them with this variation of whether you want A-style dials, being the more simple dial, or B-style dials with separate 24 hours and minutes around the edge of the dial, and with separate length hands. And of course the hands are thermally blued, which gives this coloration to them, which is more complex, much more rich, and also is a more expensive process than simply chemically bluing them, which is the way less expensive watches tend to do it. And so with their riveted leather straps, I think these are a really beautiful option if you want to go for something which is utilitarian, but also quietly incredibly well made, very, very well detailed, and still produced by hand to a large extent in Germany. And so this watch comes in £1,050 in any configuration, whether you go for it with the A or the B style dial, automatic or the manually wound movement. This next piece is a quite peculiar watch, but I think one which has gained a great deal of attention because it's a watch which is so striking in terms of being something very different to be seen on the market, that it's an interesting model to consider. because this is the Hamilton Khaki 50mm, a watch which doesn't seem to fit into any category in terms of really a buyer's audience. Now, certainly this is a watch to be owned by someone with very large wrists, but I think it's a strikingly interesting piece for even someone with moderate wrists who wants something very striking. Now, bearing in mind the fact this watch is in fact 12mm wider than the conventional manually wound version of the Khaki, it's worth considering why this watch is this size, and the reason for this is because Hamilton have been trying to hark back to some of their military history. And whilst this watch is squarely aimed at the field watch audience, I think that because this watch is of this size, it creates an interesting balance between the pilot's watches made by Hamilton as well as the military watches produced by Hamilton in the middle of the 20th century. And certainly the design with its vintage-style numerals and those particularly characteristic hands do draw the eye to that period of military watches. I think as a general design it's quite timeless depending upon the version you go for. Starting with the case, this piece doesn't have quite the sharpness of the vintage-style models released by Hamilton recently, and so instead opts for a more rounded shape to this Khaki style of case, but still has quite a tall style of bezel, a large crown, and also widely spaced lugs, which are 24mm across, so that straps will be in proportion to the rest of the case. And the case is finished in this bead-blasted satinised surface, which is available in several versions, whether you go for the standard steel coloration of it, a version which is fully blacked out, or a model which has a sort of this brown PVD application to it, which appears as though the watch has been aged in a way which is unconventional but I think quite striking. Underneath this watch is subtly domed sapphire crystal covering the entirety of that immense dial. This watch has really several dial variants, but all share the same general aesthetic. One has this style of hands which are very reminiscent of older Hamilton Khakis, whilst the numerals are also very much of that 1960s and 70s period, with this soft style of font to them around those 12 hours, and then this off-coloured sort of aged luminova set of indices running around the edge. Now, it should be noted that these are in fact very, very thick applied indices, which are made out of solid luminova instead of being simply painted onto the dial, and this means they're nearly a millimetre thick, which means they're immensely bright, and Hamilton have made a point of saying this, that they are up to twice as bright as an equivalent style of luminova dial, which I think is very impressive, and does, I think, make great use of the fact that this watch has much more dial real estate than a normal watch, due to its immense size. Due to the immense size of the dial, the date window has been moved into the centre of the dial somewhat, but I think doesn't pose much of a problem because it's aligned perfectly with that 24-hour ring, as well as the fact that its size means that it matches very, very well, and doesn't get in the way of any of the painted or indeed applied numerals, and so it really is actually quite a good coincidence. Whilst the dial comes in a variety of variants, each matching its case design, with the brown style of case having a brown dial, the silver steel style of case having a black dial, and then the blacked out version having a black dial with dark numerals as well. The movement inside this watch is an interesting choice, because Hamilton have gone for a manually wound movement, although in their nomenclature they call a manually wound movement mechanical, which I find deeply aggravating, because really that's any mechanical movement. But anyway, aside from that, it's the caliber H50, which is based on that ETA architecture as a manually wound movement. However, it runs at a lower beat rate of 3 Hz, giving it 6 ticks per second rather than 8, but this does extend the power reserve to 80 hours, making it a much more wearable, much more usable manually wound experience, meaning that you don't have to wind it up quite so often. And so with this whole package, with its attractive leather strap and its unique appearance, I think this watch is a very interesting 100-metre water-resistant field watch for someone who wants something a bit more bold and a bit more interesting. And the price of this watch ranges between $1,035 for the steel case to $1,150 for either of the PVD versions. Now, the next piece I'd like to speak about, and indeed the penultimate watch in this video, I'd like to speak about a piece which competes very much directly with the Seiko Marine Master tuner. And normally I would have simply put a tuner into the video at this point because they are spectacularly well-engineered dive watches with their 1,000-metre water resistance, albeit capable of resisting up to 4 times as much as that under certain circumstances. But I think to many people, and understandably so, having a 4,000-metre rated dive watch is not necessarily their highest priority, and quite frankly the 1,000 metres this Oris offers are quite reasonable. And I think the reason that I've chosen this Oris is because in terms of technology, in terms of sheer details, this piece does provide a very, very complete package with interesting movement modification, a very clever case build, and general design which I think is very much at the top of Oris's game. And this is the Oris Prodiver GMT. And traditionally the Prodiver has been the slightly less popular alternative to the Oris Aquis, as its bigger brother. Now previously, in previous generations, the Prodiver has never been a looker, but in this most recent iteration, it's more aligned with the Oris Aquis in terms of design, albeit with these straightened hands, and I think looks absolutely fantastic. This watch is 49mm across, but with its quite short lug-to-lug length, there is a great deal of play in that in terms of being able to offer something which is more wearable than you would expect. Also, the watch is fully titanium with a titanium caseback, which is not something you would normally expect to see, because usually titanium cases, including watches like the Tudor Pelagos, have a steel caseback. And there really is an enormous amount to talk about with this watch, from its beautifully brushed and polished areas across the case, and of course those screwed lugs, which admittedly do only take Oris straps and bracelets, but the quality of their straps and bracelets is such that actually if you enjoy the design of the watch, they fit very, very well with the timepiece and don't have the large Oris branding, which I know puts some people off the Aquis rubber straps. Instead there's much more moderate branding. And in terms of the case itself, the bezel is probably one of the most interesting elements, because one has a special setup whereby one has to pull upwards on this black area of the bezel in order to release it and then be able to turn it, which allows the whole bezel to be much more secure than a conventional bezel, and does play into the fact that this watch is a professional dive watch. Then one has a ceramic bezel insert which has a rubberized part to it, and of course this is screwed into place in those several areas via the same style of screw as on the lugs and also on the crown guards. The watch also has a very similar arrangement of crown and helium escape valve as something like that Zoretto or indeed a Rolex Sea Dweller, with the crown placed at 3 and screwed in addition to the helium escape valve on the opposite side of the case being automatic on this watch as well, as with those other two watches I've mentioned. But the dial, I think, is a very impressive piece underneath this domed anti-reflective sapphire crystal. Because on this dial one sees this rather attractive style of wave dial, which is more associated with the Omega Seamasters, but works very, very well here. And whilst it appears very busy, it's actually incredibly clear to read and not cluttered at all. One has applied indices with BGW9 Luminova, which is also seen on the bezel and the hands, and then one has the GMT function, which doesn't interfere with the reading of the rest of the time, thanks to its placement in the centre of the dial, with that yellow GMT hand for the function. Also, one should note that the seconds have been removed from the centre of the dial and instead placed on this double-ended style hand as a sub-dial at 9. Now, the beauty of this is that it allows this to simply show whether the watch is running or not, whilst admittedly one side of the hand is painted so you can use it to actually time the seconds, but most importantly it is there to serve as a demonstration the watch is running. One has also other details, such as the fact that the date has actually been moved outwards through a movement modification, which I'll speak about later, which means that one doesn't have this sort of interference with the centre of the dial, but instead it's tucked away on the side. Now, beating inside this watch is the Oris Caliber 748, and normally Oris calibers are extremely similar to Cerreto movements which they're based on, but in this case one has a movement which is very heavily modified, because rather than going for an inherently GMT-based movement, such as for example an ETA 2893, they've instead gone for a movement which was based on the ETA 2824 architecture in the form of the Cerreto SW220-1, and that's the day-date version in fact. But in this case they've modified it to take this GMT function in addition to moving the date out to that further position in order to widen the movement, but also in order to give it this more legible dial. And this means that one also has the small seconds at 9, and the fact that the watch now has 3 extra joules, having 28 joules now, running at 4 Hz and having a 38-hour power reserve. And of course this watch does have the Oris red rotor, even though it's not visible underneath that solid caseback. And really all of these points suggest that this watch is a really fantastic idea for someone who wants a dive watch to travel with, a dive watch they can take away to an exotic location before diving, with the use of that GMT function to be able to know what time it is at home, and then be able to use the watch for diving very, very effectively, and of course with extreme functionality. And the watch comes either on a titanium bracelet, or indeed a rubber strap with a titanium clasp, with the price varying between £2,450 and £2,520. This final watch is a piece which I think is an interesting addition to this video because it presents a luxury dress watch, or at least an everyday dress watch, which fits into this category of being large, but not too large as a watch which can be worn very formally. Now, Chronoswiss is not a brand which shies away from creating large and quite bold timepieces, as is seen in their 44mm pieces, but this piece at a slightly more moderate 41mm by 13.85mm thick is, by any stretch of the imagination, a large watch on the wrist, with its large onion crown and those quite exaggerated styles of lugs. But I think it's a beautiful looking timepiece, and which incorporates real craftsmanship, with an approach to watchmaking which is very different to what one normally sees from brands. Now, the reason why I say this is because this watch is, in many ways, a watch which doesn't have quite the in-house nature of some other watches on the market. However, in terms of the actual care taken with this timepiece, in terms of man-hours, and in terms of the care taken to create each part, this piece outdoes pretty much anything else I've found on the market at this sort of price range. Of course, the most striking element of this watch at first glance is perhaps the case, with its glorious design, which is both slightly steampunk and curious, but also with a very classical charm to it as well. Now, the case itself has these wonderful convex style bezels, which have this polished area on them, in addition to polished tops to the lugs, which are also very heavily exaggerated. One also has this ribbing and these ridges with this machined, knurled edge around the caseback, but also around the front of the watch, which is more subtle than on some previous models, but still extremely attractive and characteristic. And then one has vertical brushing across the side of the case, with a very fine degree and very fine grain, to just round off the design and give it this sharper point, which helps to break up the shape and give this watch a more visual impact. Now, I will point out this watch does have a 100-metre water resistance, which is an interesting characteristic of this brand, that they do focus on making a watch which is wearable every day. And I really do love this about the Chronoswiss brand, and I personally am very fond of the brand because I think there's a group of really fantastic people behind it, but also the amount of care they take to make a watch which is wearable every day is remarkable. But then if one looks at the dial beneath the domed sapphire crystal, which is very subtly domed to give this soft curvature over the front of the watch, one sees a dial which is like no other. Around the edge one sees this raised and brushed section, which gives the individual minute graduations, and of course this watch is a regulator, and this means that each hand runs on its own separate dial, with the minutes in the centre of the dial, the seconds at the bottom, and the hours at the top, giving this fantastic display. This is also a flying regulator, so each of these subdials are elevated above the dial itself by a number of bridges, which sit free standing and are screwed into the surface of the dial. And with this watch, the layering and the elevation of the subdials is quite mesmerising, whilst one has hands which are beautifully polished over their top, but luminous to make them more usable, with the date placed at 3 o'clock. Now, it is true to say that these watches are interesting because these are handmade watches, and if you visit Chronoswiss in Lucerne in Switzerland, you can actually see the watchmakers assembling them, and of course the parts are also made, although one can't see that aspect of the production. But the beautiful fact about these watches is that they really are handmade products, and so the detailing is beyond what you could expect from another watch of this sort of price, with partial skeletonization underneath the seconds as well. But the characteristic of this watch's name is that it has this day and night indicator, which is run at the 9 o'clock position, and shows this 24-hour style of display, which instead of having a hand, has this demonstration of the stars and the daytime. And it should be noted that these stars do actually glow in the dark, which is a really detailed and wonderful element to a watch, which is the sort of piece that will make you smile each time you put it on. Now, the movement which powers this watch, that can be seen through the front and also the exhibition caseback on the back, is based on the ETA 2895, and it's the calibre C296. Now, it should be noted that the choice to have an ETA-based movement inside this watch was not coincidence, because according to Chronoswiss and their own statements about this, it's a direct choice to be able to offer more in terms of customisation and handmade detailing than have to spend the money and indeed most of the price of the watch on developing a specific movement. And I can certainly understand this perspective because it means that you're able to enjoy more of a high horology experience for a more affordable price. And they really have reworked the movement comprehensively, with the key elements of being automatic running at 4 Hz and having a 42-hour power reserve being retained. However, of course, it has this regulator module installed, as well as that day-night complication. But also this watch has extra jewels. It has 31 jewels in the case of this watch, and is fully decorated with a customised rotor with the Chronoswiss logo, and of course it's blued as well. But the detailing is fundamentally fantastic throughout. One sees detailing and decoration throughout the back of the movement, but also one can see it through the way they've reworked the date wheel and other elements on the front of the watch to really use just the core of this ETA movement to their own purposes. And the price of this watch depends quite significantly upon the case material, because in steel the price of this watch is 6,590 Swiss francs, which goes up to 15,700 if you go for it in gold. But I think either way this is quite a remarkable piece for the price, and a very interesting alternative to other pieces on the market, with a very different story and truly wonderful detailing. And so I'll conclude this video here, but do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of my choices, and indeed of the watches which I've discussed, whether there would be others that you won't have included, or some thoughts on the ones which I have included, as I'm always curious to hear what you think. And so if you did enjoy the video, then do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in future. Also, do follow me on Instagram under the name of simply I'm on the Watch Guy, as you'll there be able to find a great deal of other horological content, photos and also videos. So thank you very much for watching. This is I'm on the Watch Guy, out.